Every woman in the village rejected him, until they discovered his shocking secret. The village of Nyandra sat nestled between rolling green hills, its red clay paths winding through clusters of thatched huts and towering baobab trees. The scent of roasting maize filled the evening air, blending with the distant sound of drumbeats from the communal square. Life in Nyandra was simple but full of traditions, where elders ruled with wisdom, and every young man and woman had a role to play. Among them was Cato, a man who had become the subject of endless whispers. Cato was different, not in a way that was obvious to the eye. He was tall and strong, with the dark, sun-kissed skin of a man who had worked the fields since childhood. His broad shoulders and sharp jawline should have made him desirable. But to the women of Nyandra, he was nothing more than a man without a future. While his peers had built mud-brick homes, secured land, and started families, Cato remained unmarried at nearly 30, an age where most men in the village already had children running at their feet. Every eligible woman had turned him away, not because he was unkind, but because he had nothing to offer. Cato had no herd of cows, no fields brimming with cassava or millet. He lived in a small, crumbling hut on the outskirts of the village, inherited from his late parents. His only possession of worth was a single old fishing net, tattered from years of use. Who would want to marry a man like that? The women whispered among themselves. Even the elders shook their heads when Cato approached them, asking for advice on finding a wife. A man must have wealth to build a home, said Mziokello, the village's eldest and most respected elder. You have nothing but that old net. No father will give his daughter to you. Cato had heard these words many times before, yet each time, they stung like fresh wounds. He had tried to change his fate. He worked harder than any man in the village, waking before the sun and casting his net into the river, hoping for a great catch that would earn him enough to start a new life. But the fish were scarce, and fate seemed determined to keep him in the shadows. That evening, as he dragged his net through the shallows, pulling up nothing but weeds, he let out a deep sigh. He gazed at the reflection of the moon rippling across the water. Is this my destiny? He muttered to himself. Across the village, preparations for the annual harvest festival were in full swing. It was a time of joy, a time when young men proved their worth, and young women chose their suitors. Cato knew, just as he had known in previous years, that no woman would pick him. But what he didn't know was that this year, everything was about to change. That night, as Cato sat outside his hut, staring at the sky, an old woman approached. Her face was lined with the wisdom of many years, and her eyes held a knowing glint. You are troubled, Cato, she said, her voice soft yet firm. Cato looked up. Everyone in the village believes I am worthless. The old woman smiled. Perhaps they do not see what is hidden. Before Cato could ask what she meant, she pressed something into his palm, a small, smooth stone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. This will show you the truth, she whispered. But remember, Cato, not all treasures shine on the surface. Then, just as mysteriously as she had come, she disappeared into the night. Cato turned the stone over in his hands, puzzled. What truth? What treasure? He didn't believe in magic or foolish superstitions. But deep down, a part of him, a desperate, hopeful part, wondered if this was the moment his fate would finally turn. Little did he know, the secret he was about to uncover would not only change his life, but shock the entire village of Nyandra. Cato sat outside his crumbling hut, rolling the smooth stone between his calloused fingers. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. Not all treasures shine on the surface. He scoffed under his breath. What did that even mean? The only treasures that mattered in Nyandra were cattle, fertile land, and the ability to provide for a family. And he had none of those. He tucked the stone into the small leather pouch tied around his waist and leaned back against the hut, staring up at the night sky. The village beyond was alive with the sounds of laughter and music. Women with brightly woven headscarves carried baskets of yams and millet to prepare for the harvest festival feast. Men gathered around fires, sharpening their spears and boasting about the year's best hunts. Cato clenched his jaw. This festival, like every other, would be another reminder of what he lacked. Most painful of all was the silent rejection from Naima, the woman he had secretly loved since they were children. Naima, with her deep brown eyes that shimmered like river stones and a laugh that could melt even the hardest heart. She had once been his friend, running barefoot through the fields with him, daring him to climb the tallest trees. But childhood dreams meant nothing in the real world. Naima had suitors, many of them. Strong men, wealthy men. Men who brought her father gifts of fine cloth, herds of goats, and baskets overflowing with ripe fruits. Cato had brought her nothing. And so, she had drifted further and further away until she no longer looked at him at all. That night, as Cato lay on his thin straw mat, he felt the weight of his reality settle over him like a heavy cloak. No matter how hard he worked, he would never be enough in the eyes of the village. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "What if they were wrong?" A new dawn, a strange discovery the next morning, Cato woke before the first rooster crowed. He slung his old fishing net over his shoulder and walked toward the river, the cool morning air brushing against his skin. As he reached the water's edge, something caught his eye, a shimmer beneath the surface. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The river was usually calm at dawn, but today, the water swirled unnaturally, forming delicate patterns that almost seemed intentional. Cato hesitated before tossing his net. He had done this 1,000 times before, but today felt different. The moment the net touched the water, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispered secrets. Cato's hands tightened around the ropes as the net grew heavier, far heavier than any catch he had ever pulled. He dug his heels into the damp earth and heaved with all his strength. Slowly, the net emerged from the river. But what lay tangled inside was not fish. It was gold. Cato's breath hitched. He blinked, certain his eyes were deceiving him. Thick, gleaming gold chains. Ancient coins, shining like captured sunlight. Small figurines, intricately carved from what looked like pure ivory. His heart pounded against his ribs. Where had this come from? How was this possible? Then he remembered the old woman. Her words. The stone she had given him. With trembling fingers, he reached into his pouch and pulled it out. It was no longer dull and ordinary. It glowed, faintly pulsating, as if alive. A chill ran down his spine. Had she known? Had she led him to this? Cato swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he was staring at something that could change everything. He was no longer just the man with nothing. He had a secret that would shake the entire village of Nyandra. Cato stood frozen at the riverbank, his hands trembling as he stared at the gold tangled in his fishing net. The morning sun reflected off the shimmering metal, casting golden flecks across the rippling water. His heart pounded in his chest. He had spent his entire life struggling, scraping by with nothing to offer, until now. But what did this mean? No one had ever spoken of treasure buried beneath the river. The elders told stories of spirits that guarded the land, warning that some riches were cursed rather than gifted. The thought sent a shiver down Cato's spine. But as he tightened his grip around the heavy net, another realization hit him. If the village found out about this, everything would change. For a long moment, he debated what to do. Should he take the treasure and keep it hidden? Should he tell someone? Would the elders claim it belonged to the village? Would Naima finally see him as worthy? At that thought, his grip tightened. He had waited long enough, suffered long enough. If fate had chosen to reward him, who was he to question it? Moving quickly, he unraveled the net, pulling out as much gold as he could carry. He wrapped the treasure in his tattered cloth and tucked it beneath his fishing basket. With one last glance at the river, he turned and hurried back to his hut, careful to keep his secret hidden. But secrets had a way of unraveling. Whispers in the wind by mid-morning, Cato felt the weight of curious eyes on him. He had gone to the marketplace as usual, buying only a handful of dried fish and maize flour. But something was different. Women gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their hands. Men eyed him with suspicion as they sharpened their machetes. Even the village children, who usually ignored him, seemed to be watching from a distance. He tried to ignore it. But when he caught the village elder, Baba Jengo, staring at him for far too long, an unease settled deep in his bones. Did they know? How? Cato's mind raced. He had been careful. He hadn't told a soul. Yet something about him had changed, and the village sensed it. Then, just as he was leaving the marketplace, he heard a voice behind him. Cato! He turned sharply, his breath catching. Naima stood before him. She was just as beautiful as ever, her dark skin glowing in the afternoon sun. Her braids were adorned with delicate cowrie shells, her wrap dress a striking shade of deep blue. But there was something else in her eyes today. Curiosity. You seem different, she said, tilting her head. Stronger. Almost as if, she hesitated, her gaze searching his face. As if you know something the rest of us don't. Cato forced a chuckle, but his hands fisted at his sides. What could I possibly know, Naima? I'm the same as I was yesterday. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more. Instead, she simply studied him, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then, to his shock, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made his stomach twist. "Perhaps," she murmured, "but we both know that nothing stays hidden in this village forever." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Cato standing in the middle of the marketplace, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was right. Secrets had a way of surfacing, and if he wasn't careful, his would cost him everything. Cato barely slept that night. Every sound outside his hut made him flinch. Every rustle of leaves sent his heart pounding. The village was stirring, sensing change in the air. And Naima's words haunted him. By morning, the tension had only grown. As Cato stepped out of his hut, he noticed a group of young men gathered by the well, speaking in hushed tones. Their leader, Django's son, Omari, locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. Omari had always been his rival, not just in the village, but in matters of the heart. He was the man everyone respected, strong and charming. He was the one who had once courted Naima before she had rejected both of them, saying she would marry only a man with true purpose. Now, for the first time, Omari regarded Cato with something other than disdain. Suspicion. Cato swallowed hard and turned away, heading toward the river. He needed to think. He needed to hide the rest of the gold before someone found it. But before he reached the edge of the village, a familiar voice stopped him. "Cato!" He turned to see an old woman, Mama Zara, the village herbalist, standing outside her hut. She leaned heavily on her staff, her weathered face unreadable. "I had a dream last night," she said, her voice slow and deliberate. "A man with empty hands suddenly held great riches. And the spirits, they were watching." Cato's mouth went dry. He tried to force a chuckle. "Mama Zara, she raised a hand, silencing him. "We do not question when fortune changes a man's fate. But beware, child. What is given can also be taken." His stomach twisted. Was this a warning? Or did she know? Cato barely made it to the river before his mind started spiraling. How had things changed so quickly? Yesterday, he was invisible. Today, he was the center of whispers, strange glances, and cryptic warnings. And then there was Naima. She had never looked at him like that before. Had she sensed his secret? Or was this some kind of test? A noise behind him made him whip around. Omari. He stood at the riverbank, arms crossed, watching Cato carefully. "You're not the same man you were a week ago," Omari said, stepping closer. "What are you hiding?" Cato's pulse thundered. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a challenge. And he wasn't sure he had the answers Omari was looking for. Cato knew he had to choose his words carefully. One wrong move, and Omari's suspicions could turn into something far worse, a confrontation. "I don't know what you're talking about," Cato said, forcing a casual shrug. Omari's gaze narrowed. "Men don't change overnight," he said, stepping closer. "First you were a nobody. Now, Naima suddenly takes interest in you? The elders whisper about you. I see the way people look at you." Cato's pulse pounded in his ears. He had hidden the gold beneath the roots of an ancient tree by the river's edge. But if Omari, or anyone, discovered it, he would be doomed. He decided to turn the tables. "And why do you care, Omari?" Cato asked. "Are you afraid that Naima might choose me over you?" Omari's jaw tightened, his muscles flexing with restrained anger. "This isn't about her," he said, though the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. "It's about truth. And the truth always comes out." With that, he turned and walked away. But Cato knew this was not over. The village's suspicion grows by the next day. The tension in the village had thickened like a brewing storm. People whispered as Cato passed. Mama Zara watched him from her hut, her piercing eyes filled with silent warnings. Even the village elders had started murmuring about his sudden change in fortune. Then, something happened that made his heart nearly stop. That evening, as Cato approached his hiding place by the river, he found the ground disturbed. Someone had been digging. His breath caught. Had they found the gold? Panic surged through him. He knelt, brushing aside the loose dirt, his fingers trembling. The gold was still there. But for how long? A rustling sound in the trees made him freeze. Someone was watching him. He turned sharply, but saw no one. The truth was unraveling faster than he could control. And deep inside, Cato knew. It was only a matter of time before the entire village discovered his secret. Cato's heart pounded as he stood by the river, staring at the disturbed ground where he had buried the gold. Someone had been here. Someone new. The air around him felt thick, pressing in from all sides. The rustling in the trees had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had not. His mind raced through possibilities. Had Omari followed him? Had one of the villagers stumbled upon the gold? Or worse, was this a trap? He needed to act fast. He couldn't risk the gold being found. Not yet. Digging frantically, he gathered the small, glimmering nuggets and tucked them into a cloth sack. His hands trembled as he secured the bundle beneath his tunic. He had to find a new hiding place. But as he turned to leave, a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere, Cato?" He spun around. Omari stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, his dark eyes sharp with suspicion. Behind him, 3 other young men from the village loomed, their expressions unreadable. They had seen everything. Cato's mouth went dry. He forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Omari took a slow step forward, his gaze dropping to Cato's tunic, where the bulge of the sack was barely concealed. "Lies." The other men exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Omari's voice was louder now, enough to carry beyond the trees. "You've been keeping secrets from us. And I think I know why." Cato clenched his fists. If Omari exposed him, everything would be over. The elders would demand an explanation. The people who had once ignored him would turn into vultures, eager to claim what they had once rejected. But before he could respond, Omari strode forward and grabbed Cato's tunic. The sack tumbled to the ground. The cloth unraveled, spilling gold nuggets onto the dirt. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the young men let out a low whistle. "By the gods," another murmured. "Where did you get this?" Omari, however, was not awed. He was furious. His jaw clenched as he stared at Cato. "You've been hiding wealth while the rest of us struggle?" His voice was laced with betrayal. "Is this why Naima suddenly sees you? Because you can buy her love?" Cato's pulse raced. "No, that's not." But Omari wasn't listening. He turned to the others. "The elders need to see this." Panic surged through Cato. If the elders knew, they would take everything. He had seen how greed worked, how the village could turn on someone in an instant. He couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, Cato lunged for the gold. But Omari was faster. He shoved Cato back hard. Cato stumbled, his feet slipping on the damp earth. His vision blurred as he fell, straight into the rushing river. The last thing he heard before the current pulled him under was the sound of Omari's voice, calling the village. Cato had lost everything. And now, the entire village would know his secret. The icy river swallowed Cato whole, its powerful currents dragging him beneath the surface. Water filled his lungs as he struggled, kicking and clawing against the unseen force pulling him deeper. He couldn't die here. Not like this. Not when everything was at stake. With a desperate thrust, Cato reached out, his fingers scraping against the jagged rocks lining the riverbed. He found a hold and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. His chest burned, his vision darkening at the edges. Just when he thought his body would give in, his head broke through the surface, and he gasped for air. The shouts of the villagers echoed from the riverbank. They had seen everything. Omari stood at the edge, his eyes wide with shock, his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, a growing crowd gathered, elders, women, and children, all staring at the gold still glistening in the dirt. The secret was out. With one final push, Cato dragged himself to the shore, collapsing onto the damp earth. His body trembled from exhaustion, but he forced himself to rise. He couldn't show weakness now. Not when everything he had fought for was about to be decided. The village chief, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a cane carved from ancient baobab wood, stepped forward. His voice was heavy with authority. "Cato, what is the meaning of this?" Cato's chest heaved as he met the chief's gaze. He had 2 choices, to lie and risk everything, or to tell the truth and face whatever came next. So he chose the truth. "I found the gold," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "It was buried deep within the hills, hidden beneath the earth for who knows how long. I kept it secret because I knew what would happen if the village found out." His eyes swept over the crowd. "You all cast me aside for years. You never saw me as worthy. But now, because of this gold, I am suddenly valuable." A murmur rippled through the villagers. Some lowered their gazes in shame. Others whispered among themselves, eyes gleaming with greed. Omari stepped forward, his expression twisted with anger. "You had no right to keep this from us." Cato's fists clenched. "And you had no right to judge me before you knew my worth." Silence fell over the gathering. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. The chief nodded slowly. "We must decide what to do next." His gaze flickered to the gold. "But Cato is right. We have failed him before. Let us not make the same mistake again." Cato swallowed hard. The moment of judgment had come. What happened next would change everything. A heavy silence lingered in the air as the village elders gathered beneath the great baobab tree, their faces lined with contemplation. The discovery of the gold had shifted everything. The people who once mocked Cato now regarded him with cautious curiosity, some even with admiration. Others, like Omari, still simmered with resentment. Cato stood at the center of it all, his clothes still damp from the river, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent his life being an outcast, rejected for not meeting the village's expectations. Now, in the space of a single evening, he had become the most important man in the community. Chief Jabari, his expression unreadable, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Cato," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "This discovery is greater than any one man. Gold brings wealth, but it also brings greed. Tell us, what do you wish to do with it?" Cato hadn't expected to be given a choice. He had imagined the village elders taking control, deciding his fate for him. But now, all eyes were on him, waiting for his decision. His fingers brushed against the small leather pouch at his waist. The same pouch he had always carried, filled with ordinary stones when he was a child, pretending to be rich. Now wealth was within his grasp, but was that truly what he wanted? He took a deep breath. "I want to use it to build something meaningful," he said, his voice firm. "Not just for me, but for the entire village." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Even Omari's scowl flickered with something close to surprise. Cato continued, his gaze unwavering. "For years, I was treated as if I was worth nothing. But I never gave up. And now that I have something of value, I refuse to let it be used to divide us. This gold can change our village. It can bring schools, better tools for our farmers, medicine for our sick. But only if we use it wisely." The chief studied him carefully. Then a slow, approving nod. "Wise words, Cato." For the first time, Cato saw something in the chief's eyes he had never seen before. Respect. From the crowd, Amina, the girl who had once rejected him, stepped forward hesitantly. There was something different in her eyes now, something softer. "You would share your fortune with those who once turned their backs on you?" Cato met her gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I would, because I know what it feels like to have nothing. And no one in this village should feel that way." Amina looked down, ashamed. "I misjudged you." Cato shrugged. "Most people did." Omari scoffed. "So what? Now you think you're better than us?" Cato turned to him, but instead of anger, there was only calm in his expression. "No, Omari. I think we have a chance to be better together." The tension in Omari's face flickered, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. The chief raised his cane, signaling for silence. "Cato, if you are true to your word, then let us make it so. The gold will be used to better our village. And you, Cato, will have a seat among the elders." Gasps rang through the crowd. Cato's breath caught in his throat. He had spent his life being seen as less than. Now he was being offered a place among those who made decisions for the village's future. He exhaled, his heart full. He had finally found where he belonged. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the rolling hills, casting long golden rays over the village. A newfound energy filled the air. Where once there had been whispers of mockery and doubt, now there was laughter, cooperation, and hope. True to his word, Cato worked alongside the village elders to ensure the gold was used wisely. Skilled workers from neighboring villages were invited to teach new techniques for farming and construction. A school was built, its walls painted with bright patterns that symbolized knowledge and unity. The healer's hut, once poorly stocked, now had medicine to treat the sick. For the first time in many years, the village thrived. One evening, as Cato stood by the riverbank, watching the water ripple under the soft breeze, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Amina standing there, her hands clasped in front of her. "I never thought I'd see the day when our village would change like this," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. Cato chuckled. "Neither did I." Amina hesitated before speaking again. "I was wrong about you, Cato. We all were." She looked down for a moment, then met his gaze. "I rejected you before because I thought you had nothing to offer. But now, I see that your true worth was never in wealth, it was in your heart." Cato studied her for a moment, the girl who had once dismissed him now standing before him with sincerity in her eyes. He smiled, but there was no bitterness, no lingering resentment. Only peace. "We all learn in our own time," he said gently. Amina took a step closer. "Perhaps in time you could learn to forgive me?" Cato exhaled, gazing at the horizon where the sky kissed the earth. "I already have." She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. As the village lights flickered on and the evening drumming began, Cato walked back toward his home, feeling something he had long been denied: acceptance, belonging, and a future he had built with his own hands. The village had once rejected him, but now they stood with him. And that was more valuable than all the gold in the world.